Oh, good morning, protege, or of course, good afternoon to my wonderful eighth period class. Hey, I hope this direct instructional Zoomcast finds you well. So this is going to be my direct instruction, and I'm actually recording this. This is live from the Bonk Kitchen in beautiful, bucolic Roselle, Illinois, about 21 miles southwest of Buffalo Grove. And this is going to be my direct instructional Zoomcast for Thursday, and this is October, or if you prefer, October 21st, 2021. Let's get into it, shall we? You guys know the drill at this point. So I'm going to share my screen with everybody. So what I would like everybody to now do is make certain again that you have dated your notes. You should have your ISN open to the right side of the next clean sheet of paper. New day, new date, new page. You need a blue or black pen, multiple colored highlighters, correctable tape. And again, I would respectfully ask you not to be highlighting and cleaning up your ISN as you're watching the Zoomcast because it's distracting you. Focus on the Zoomcast, focus on taking your copious notes in your ISNs. Then when you're done with the Zoomcast, that's when you go clean up your ISN with your correctable tape. And of course, don't forget your multiple highlighters. So make certain again, you've dated your notes for October 21st, 2021. It's Thursday. So today we're going to talk about primarily for my direct instruction, the impact of the automobile. So write that down. That's your topic heading. So again, there's going to be times where I'm going to go a little fast, and that's okay because the beauty of the Zoomcast is you're working at your own pace. You don't worry about anybody else. It doesn't matter how fast you finish the race. What matters is you finish well. All right, so I need you to please write this down. So during the 1920s, and I've already introduced several new inventions that were introduced, inventions like the washing machine, inventions like the sewing machine, the vacuum cleaner, the refrigerator. These inventions are all inventions in the 21st century that we take for granted, but not 100 years ago. These were game changers. But when you look at inventions that transforms a decade, there is no doubt in my mind that no invention did more to transform the Roaring Twenties than the automobile. The automobile is to the Roaring Twenties what probably the smartphone did for the previous decade. I like to call the previous decade between 2011 or 2000. Let me get this straight. It's 2011. I was right the first time. And right now, so that we would call that decade the two teens. Okay. So the smartphone changed everything. It was a game changer. Life in America was a very different one before there were smartphones. Automobile was the same thing. All right. So if you direct your attention to the overhead screen, that is the automobile that's going to change the face of America. And that, of course, is called the Model T Ford. And of course, it was invented and developed by, whenever you think of automobiles, the guy you always think about is Henry Ford. Now, there is a catch, though, with the automobile. So the automobile actually was not invented in the 1920s. There is a history behind it, which I'm going to get to shortly. So why did the automobile change America, the face of America in the 1920s? Because number one, at the start of the decade, we were still, again, a very strong influence of the horse and buggy. But by the end of the decade, we were all automobile. So you were able to get from point A to point B faster. That's a huge benefit the automobile has over, say, the horse and buggy. Number two, it was easier to travel from one point to another by, again, traveling by automobile. And number three, what the automobile also gave people was mobility. It gave you more flexibility in terms of where you live and how far away you would need to be in terms of your proximity to your place of work. I'm going to use myself as an example. I'm going to dovetail back to this later on. I live 21 miles from beautiful Buffalo Grove in Roselle. And yet, because of the automobile and because of highways like Lake Cook Road and especially Route 53, I can literally drive from Roselle to Buffalo Grove or from Buffalo Grove back to Roselle, depending on how traffic is, I can make it in under 30 minutes. That's astounding. So it gives you more mobility to say, I mean, there's nothing wrong with living in Buffalo Grove or Arlington Heights or Wheeling, but I really like where I live. And the automobile gives me that luxury, that freedom, that independence to choose where I want to live. And that's, again, one of the benefits why the automobile became so incredibly popular. So if you direct your attention up to the overhead screen, I want you to take a good look at that photograph because, again, Henry Ford did not invent the automobile. So that is a very primitive form of what the automobile looked like. So if you go back to the history of the automobile, so when you see the first real automobile, the one that's gas powered, and you can actually trace it back to the mid 1880s in 1885 by a gentleman by the name of Carl Benz. You ever hear of Mercedes Benz, the same company? So the Germans were the ones who really started, again, coming up with this idea of this gas-powered automobile. And this goes back to 1885. Now, in addition, so when did you see the first automobile appear in the United States? So that wouldn't be until about 1893. And so that's going to be about 8 years later. And so the first gas-powered automobile in America was developed, ironically, by two brothers. Again, I think about the Wright brothers, Orville and Wilbur, excuse me, with the first flight at Kitty Hawk, the airplane. Well, in the automobiles, it was also a brother team of Charles and Frank Duryea, D-U-R-Y-E-A, Duryea. And their first gas-powered automobile actually traces back to 1893, and I believe this was a Duryea automobile. It doesn't quite look like a Model T Ford. So why is it then, if the automobile's roots actually go back to, again, Carl Benz in 1885 in Germany, or the Duryea brothers back in 1893, why is it that whenever you think of the automobile in the Roaring Twenties, you right away assume, or you make that connection, if you will, with Henry Ford? I'm going to get there in just a moment. So before I get more into Henry Ford and the automobile, I'd like you to write this down. So the automobile also is going to impact two other industries. So it's not just transportation. Again, you look at America in 1920, right at the cusp of a decade. Remember, a decade begins on the one, technically, not the zero. So 1921 technically marks the beginning of the Roaring Twenties, which makes this the 100th anniversary of this wonderful decade. But again, it's by the end of the decade, even though at the beginning of the decade, it was still still strongly horse and buggy. But by 1930, we were definitely dominated by the automobile. So there's two other industries that will greatly benefit from the development of the automobile, especially the Model T Ford of Henry Ford. The rubber industry. So question, draw a line off the side. Remember, I've been talking to you guys about more oral notes. In other words, you're not just writing down what's on the screen, the main notes. You guys are doing a good job with that, but now you got to take it to the next level. You got to be adding additional information, because now I'm going to start assessing more on oral notes besides just the main notes. So where in the automobile do you think rubber comes into play? Write it down. The answer is the tire industry. Firestone, Goodyear. These are big manufacturers of tires for the automobile. They're going to greatly benefit from Henry Ford and the Model T Ford being mass produced. What about the steel industry? Draw a line off to the side. So rubber, of course, is for your tires. Steel would be primarily for the frame of the car. Now, what's interesting is if you look at more modern 21st century automobiles, they tend to be more on the outside, at least the exterior. You see a lot more plastic going into it, but the frame still needs to be steel. It's got to provide that foundation. But the old automobiles, they didn't use plastic. It was all steel. They were made to last. They were Ford tough. All right, I'd like you to write this down. So I want to share with you some other interesting ways that the automobile changed America. Now, again, a decade technically begins on the one, so 1921. But if you're going to start with the Roaring Twenties in 1920, I'm not going to quibble over it. But if you look at America in 1920, and then you look at America in 1930, it looked really dramatically different. And that's because of the impact of the automobile. It was the game changer, the way the smartphone changed life in the two teens. And even if you go back to the 1990s, when the internet was developed or being introduced and developing, same thing. It changes the lives of the American people, something that you take for granted. We didn't have the internet in the late 80s, early 90s, but by the end of the 90s, everybody was using the internet constantly. It changed our lives forever. So number one, mass production. Absolutely. Mass production is something, this is one of the reasons, and I would draw a line off to the side, this is where Henry Ford gets all the credit for the automobile. because he was really, there were lots of automobile manufacturers at the turn of the 20th century. But what Henry Ford was able to do was he was able to apply the principles. Remember a guy by the name of Frederick W. Taylor? Remember in chapter 13? See how I'm weaving together elements of a previous story from unit 1? You don't drop that. You see if you can work it in. Henry Ford greatly studied Frederick W. Taylor's views about production, mass production. Remember, he used to have the stopwatch. And the whole idea of mass production, you have a whole bunch of people working together on an assembly line, and everybody has a specific role. You don't build a car by yourself from beginning to the end, but you're responsible for a specific part of installing on the car. Maybe it's the windshield wipers, maybe it's the tires, maybe it's an element with the engine, but whatever it is, that is your task. So the influence of Frederick W. Taylor on Henry Ford is absolutely incalculable. It's immeasurable. It was huge. So please write this down. So here's an example. So Henry Ford in 1908, okay, he's competing with a lot of different automobile manufacturers, more than you realize. It's a fascinating history and how it very quickly shrank and became consolidated. But between 1908 through 1913, when Henry Ford at the Ford Motor Company began to first mass produce the Model T Ford, it used to take him 14 hours, that's 2 shifts of workers, to manufacture one single car. So Henry Ford was constantly seeking efficiency. He was always looking for ways, how can I build a car faster? How can I build a car cheaper? How can I build a car better and still provide that same quality? So look what happens. So now let's look at 1920. So now you're looking at about, again, you're looking 12 years later. So 12 years after Henry Ford started mass producing the Model T Ford, by 1920, it now took him 93 minutes to build one car. That's 1 hour, another 30 minutes, and then tack on another 3 minutes beyond that. So that's less than 1 shift of one set of workers. So why is it so important that Henry Ford was able to cut back on the mass production of a car from, again, 14 hours, 2 shifts, to now 93 minutes? Maybe this quote will help you. So I want you guys to put your pens down for just a few moments where you're going to write a reflection on this briefly. Here's the quote. What Ford actually has done in his manufacturing techniques, his deliberate price cutting, and his deliberate wage raising, was to demonstrate one of the great principles in modern industrialism. This is the principle that the more goods you produce, the less it costs you to produce them. And the more people are well off, the more they can buy. Frederick Lewis Allen, The Big Change, 1952. So here's what I want you guys to do. I want you to pause my Zoomcast, take about 3 to 5 minutes, draw a line off to the side. You don't have to write the quotes. What do you think that Mr. Allen meant in The Big Change as he's describing the impact of Henry Ford? So take about 3 to 5 minutes. I'm going to continue on. By the way, Henry Ford also paid his workers more than anybody else. If everybody else was making $2.50 a day, Henry Ford was paying his workers $5 a day. Why do you suppose he did that? Answer: if you're making more money than anybody else, A, you're going to be more productive. You're going to work faster. You're going to be more efficient. You're going to be a happier worker. A happier worker is a more efficient one. And 2, you got extra money in your pocket. What are you going to do with that extra money? Answer: you're going to turn around and you're going to buy an automobile. And guess who you're going to buy it from? Henry Ford. So what Henry Ford has realized, really simple, is if you pay your workers a little bit more, they're going to take that extra money and turn around and go buy an automobile from him, which means he's going to get his money back. And there's another thing Henry Ford does that ties in with this quote by Frederick Lewis Allen that I'm going to share with you shortly. But we'll do that in a bit. So I want you guys to skip a full page. I want you to go to the right side of the next clean sheet of paper. This will be a new set of notes, and we're going to come back to those previous notes. Don't worry. So make sure, and again, you date your notes for today. It's October 21st. It's Thursday, and you're going to write down guide questions, the Ford Motor Company. I've been sharing this video for years. This is one of the first videos I successfully uploaded into one of my PowerPoints. It's a great one. It was actually produced by the Ford Motor Company, and your tour guide, if you will, is a guy by the name of Kelly. All right, so let me give you some guide questions. And remember, I'm going to go through these quickly. Pause the Zoomcast. You guys have really gotten good with that. Pause it, give yourself a chance to catch up and skip a couple lines between the guide questions. That's why I love these so much. Number one, how did mass production and the automobile change America? This absolutely ties into what I talked about earlier about how Henry Ford was so influenced by the principles, the scientific principles of Frederick Taylor. Skip a line or two. Number two, why did Henry Ford pay his workers more and have them work less? Now, I actually did answer the first part of this question. You should already know the answer to why he paid his workers more. I gave you two reasons. Well, why did he have them only work an 8-hour shift when everybody else was working 10, 12, 14 hours? He wasn't being benevolent. He wasn't being nice about it. There's a reason for it. It's about productivity. It's about efficiency. And Kelly's going to share that with you. Number three, how many years was the Model T Ford built? It's a multiple part question. So again, I'm going to go through this really quickly. You're going to need to pause the Zoomcast. Number two, what were the color choices that Henry Ford offered if you wanted to buy a Model T Ford? Number three, what was the cost of a Model T Ford that was built in 1909? And how many Model T Fords were actually built? Good luck.
Hi, this is Kelly from Car Data Video. Today we're going to have a history lesson. Of all the automobiles that have ever been designed and built in the world, there's one that stands out as most significant above them all, and that's the Model T Ford. The Model T introduced mass production and single-handedly brought us from a horse and buggy level of technology to one where we had machines that were run by gasoline engines. Using a moving assembly line, Henry Ford was able to build these things in about 1/10 the time it took to build other vehicles by hand previous to the Model T. The Model Ts were simple, they were rugged, they were cheap, and as Henry Ford used to say, you can have any color you want as long as it's black. When they were first introduced in 1909, they sold for $950, which doesn't sound like much to us today. Back then, that was quite a lot of money. Henry Ford cleverly paid his employees $5 a day, which back then was a huge amount of money compared to other jobs that they could get. He also reduced their workday from 9 to 8 hours, but again, by doing that, he could have 3 production shifts working and hence build cars around the clock. All of this was going on at a time of economic difficulty and transition, and so the result of this is people would come from all over the country to get jobs working in Detroit at the auto factories, and of course, their job of choice was with Ford. Production of the Model A's went for 19 years, from 1908 to 1928. And the last ones were built that weren't very much different from the very first ones that he originally produced. They had wooden spoked wheels with metal rims pressed on them. You can see here what they're doing is hand filing the spokes to make them smooth so they can be painted. The engine was a ridiculously simple, by today's standard and light, 177 cubic inch, which is 2.9 liter, 4-cylinder engine, which produced 20 horsepower. The vehicle weighed about 1,200 pounds, depending on which body style you got, and would be good for about 40 to 45 mile an hour top speed. And it had 2 forward gears. The assembly line was split so that the frame and the wheels and tires and everything were assembled at one point, and then the bodies were assembled separately, and then at one point the body would be dropped onto the frame. Over the years, an enormous number of body styles were created. You had a touring car, a roadster pickup, a ton truck, a closed cab ton truck, a coupe, a 2-door, a 4-door, a center door, a station wagon, and a convertible. Pretty versatile vehicle. Eventually, the Model T was replaced by a Model A, which was a modernized, stylized version of a vehicle that looked quite the same. Highland Park was the first modern assembly plant, and is where the Model Ts were produced. And just like today, when they're done being assembled, they're driven off the assembly line. But look at these vehicles as they come out. Look at all the different body styles, many of which we read, and these are all just different versions of Model Ts. Finally, after 19 years of production, Henry Ford had actually built almost 15.5 million Model Ts. and they were by far the most popular and most plentiful vehicle on the road. And here you can see the assembly of the 15 millionth, which is a four-door convertible model. And as you can see, they've added some paint colors other than just black. And that actually is Henry Ford there driving off the assembly line and driving in that 15 millionth Model T Ford. This particular one hadn't gone through final assembly quality control. You can see how Henry had to give a little nudge there to get it shut properly. To start a Model T, you had to hand crank it, but because the engine wasn't very big and it was low compression, all it would take was about a half a turn and it would fire right up. Back then, riding in a car was an occasion. It was a big excursion. It was fun. Just the ride itself was quite entertaining. Keep in mind that going somewhere in a car was probably 10 times faster than going by horse or buggy, which is what they were accustomed to before. Back then, cities were just developing and most of the roads were terrible, especially the country roads. And so the Model T had to be built in such a way where it could handle anything all the way from no road to city roads. And it actually did a very good job of that. Most of the country roads were mud roads or dirt roads. And in the city, there was no snow plows. If it flooded, you had to ford it. And so you just had to deal with all the stuff. And the Model T was miraculous at being able to handle almost any road condition you could imagine. So here you've got the original Ford Model T, the great grandparent of most every car you see on the road today. This is Kelly from Car Data Video.
So a couple of observations. Number one, every year I show that video and I'm always amazed, and I thought Kelly hit the nail on the head, figuratively speaking, the durability. They didn't plow the streets like we do today. Many of the streets were not paved. You saw the way that the Model T Ford had to deal with the snow, had to deal with the mud. I like the one part where he was going over the edge. You couldn't do that today. The car would fall over. And it was just amazing considering how, this car is over 110 years old, and yet the durability that really was required in order for it to deal with all these conditions. It's truly remarkable. And I've even thinking about at the beginning when the father was hand cranking the car and starting it up, and how my car, I drive a Chevy, how I push a button to start the car. It's amazing to me how much things have changed in, again, a little over 100 years. And the other observation is, when you look at the Model T Ford from 1908 until about 1928-ish, it really hadn't changed that much. The design was pretty much the same. I know Kelly was saying there were different variations, but the variations were very subtle. And then the other thing was there was two things that start to impact the Ford Motor Company in terms of sales. One was, again, Ford liked to keep things consistent. So the design of the car changed, but not a lot. And number two, the other thing was his insistence on you can get in any color you want as long as it's black. I always drive black cars myself, but not everybody likes black. And when you have other motor companies, or I should say automobile companies like General Motors, they were one of the first ones to realize, hey, what if we offer different colors? And that's one of the reasons why General Motors will eventually eclipse the Ford Motor Company as being the biggest automobile manufacturer in America. And one of the reasons is because they gave people more choice in terms of color. One of the few mistakes that Henry Ford made in terms of the mass production of the Model T Ford. All right, let's continue on, shall we? So go back to the previous page of notes. We're going to continue my direct instructional notes. So by 1924, and again, you go back to 1908, okay? And think about when Henry Ford began to mass produce the automobile. And every passing year, he was always looking for ways to figure out how can I produce more cars in less time. So by 1924, the cost of an automobile, this is just astounding to me. In 1917, the car had dropped from $950 down to $850. So you could buy a Model T Ford in 1908 for $950, which in those days was a lot of money. And people couldn't use credit like we can today. And number two, by 1924, the cost of a Model T Ford had dropped to $290. So it's under $300. So what Henry Ford was able to do by the middle of the Roaring Twenties, I'm going to say it, you ready? He made the Model T Ford much more affordable. Use your fingers, use the bunny ears, affordable. It was brilliant. By the way, tying in with the video clip, why did he have his workers work less? Because if you worked an 8-hour shift, You could have 3 shifts of workers working 8 hours each. You work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, which means you could manufacture more cars in less time. And the more cars you could produce, as that quote pointed out, that means you could charge your consumers less and less and less. He was able to make the automobile affordable, and that is huge. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you direct your attention up to the overhead screen, the man that really helped transform America, the way the smartphone, transformed America in the 2000s, the way the internet transformed America in the grunge 90s, Henry Ford and the Model T Ford is going to transform America in the Roaring Twenties. What you see in 1920 in America compared to 1930 is a very different country. And that's because of the automobile. Let's continue on. Now, by 1929, okay, we're getting towards the end of the decade. Over 4 million Americans in some way, shape, or form were employed by the automobile industry. Not necessarily working for the Ford Motor Company, could be certainly, but other companies like General Motors, which is going to become the big player eventually, partly because of the decision that Henry Ford did on his insistence that you can only get a car, a Model T in black. So by 1929, the biggest employer of the United States of America was the automobile industry. And again, you go back to 1920, that was not even remotely the case. This is a great example, and you should draw a line off to the side. Another impact of the automobile industry, and more specifically, the impact of Henry Ford and mass producing the Model T Ford. He didn't invent it, but he was the first to successfully mass produce it, and that was the game changer. Let's talk about gas stations, shall we? So again, I talked earlier about the rubber industry. I talked about the steel industry. What about gasoline? Why do you need gasoline? Well, because it's a gas-powered engine, and you need gasoline to make the engine work, to make it go, make the car go. So this is, if you direct your attention to the overhead screen, this is a photograph of an old-time gas station. So called, I recognize this, Sinclair. I recognize that right there. And what's interesting is I remember Sinclair gas stations when I was a really little boy in the late 60s. Sinclair is gone, even though I was in San Diego the week before school started, and I went to Coronado Island, and I saw they still have a Sinclair gas station. I wonder if that's the only gas station that's a Sinclair that's around the United States of America. So here we go. So in 1920, please write this down. So by 1920, there were about 1,500 gas stations that were scattered throughout the United States of America, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from New York City all the way to, of course, the city by the bay, San Francisco. Los Angeles was just now beginning to develop and becoming the second biggest country in America, primarily because of Hollywood. But look what happens. By 1930, because of, again, Henry Ford's ability to mass produce an automobile on a scale never seen before, applying the scientific principles of Frederick W. Taylor. See how, again, I'm weaving together information from Unit 1 into Unit 2? That's what history is, kids. It's telling the story. By the end of the decade, there were now 120,000 gas stations scattered throughout the United States of America. Astounding. What these numbers tell me, you should draw a line off to the side. It's real simple. More Americans are now driving an automobile instead of using a horse and buggy. The numbers tell the story. Absolutely. So when you talk about, again, who else benefits from the automobile industry? The steel industry certainly benefits the frame of the car. The rubber industry, making the tires, Goodyear, Firestone. But another industry that's going to also benefit from the, again, continued success, the growing success and popularity of the Model T Ford is the oil industry. So you would have to ask the question, so why would the oil industry benefit? You should draw a couple lines off to the side, because number one, you need oil to lubricate the engine. Got to do that. Still have to, every 3,000 miles, your folks have to take their car in, whether to a dealership or to a Jiffy Lube. You got to change the oil. Got to do it. But the other reason why oil is important, draw a line off to the side, is you take the oil, you refine the oil, and when you refine the oil, what does it become? It becomes gasoline. And that's what makes the car go. So who else benefits from the automobile industry and its growing popularity? Why, our old friend, draw a line off to the side, John D. Rockefeller. Everybody thought that when Standard Oil was broken up in 1911, that was the end of Rockefeller's reign of controlling everything seemingly because of the oil industry. And guess what? He's back again, making more money than he ever even imagined, probably because of the automobile. And this is one of the biggest reasons why John D. Rockefeller is considered the wealthiest human being in recorded history that's ever walked the earth. Over $330 billion. And a big reason for that money, he was able to amass that fortune, is because of Henry Ford successfully mass producing the Model T Ford. See how we're, again, weaving together this information? That's how you learn history. You're telling the whole story. All right, please write this down. So here's another change that will be brought, that the automobile is going to bring to America. And one is a little side note. I was thinking about this with the gas stations. Now that, again, Ford Motor Company, General Motors, they basically now announced that within the next decade, they're no longer going to make gas-powered engines. All future cars, probably by 2030, will all be electric. So that means now that our whole country is going to be transformed, because you won't need gas stations, but rather you're going to need stations, powering stations that will be able to charge the engines in terms of electricity. So by the time you guys are adults and driving cars, gas stations in the next 10 to 20 years are going to look very different. They're not going to be dispensing gas. They're going to be converting over and being able to give you the ability to charge your engine in terms of electricity, like charging a battery. So another industry that's going to greatly benefit, another way, I should say, not an industry, another way that the automobile industry is going to change is, again, mobility. And this dovetails back to what I had mentioned earlier in my Zoomcast. So because of the automobile, so prior to the automobile, if you were working at a job and you had got around by horse and buggy, or you had to walk, chances are you wanted to work fairly close to home and vice versa. But what the automobile industry did was it gave people mobility. So now, because of the automobile, you don't necessarily have to live near the big cities where a lot of the jobs were. You can move further and further out and away from the cities, like Chicago. And so what you have is, really, in the 1920s, there were suburbs before it, but you're really going to start to see these smaller communities popping up, developing outside big cities, like, of course, Chicago, my hometown. And a great example of this is Roselle. This is actually the 100th anniversary of Roselle's founding. It used to be just a small little farming community of German farmers that were primarily dairy farmers. But because of the automobile's growing popularity, Roselle became a suburb, and a thriving one. And if you direct your attention to the overhead screen, this should look familiar. This is Kemmerling Pool. Remember we talked about referendums with Unit 1? This is the lane right here that I usually swim in when I do my laps, when I go swimming outside. Couple other fun little points. Number one, another reason why Henry Ford was really good, besides mass production, how about advertising? Henry Ford was also an astute understanding, or had an astute understanding of the importance of advertising. So, pardon me, this is, again, notice 1910, Model T Ford touring car, completely equipped, $950. Advertising, trying to reach out to your consumer. Here's another one. And whenever you see the big brown truck that goes by, the UPS truck, you see them everywhere, whether it's in Buffalo Grove or Roselle. Here's UPS, but this is going back over 100 years ago. And then finally, let's talk about women drivers, shall we? So when you talk about women drivers, and you talk about, again, equal rights amendments, I was thinking about that. You know, women gained the right to vote. They could vote in the election in 1920. And then afterwards, as a result of the 19th Amendment, women gained the right to vote. That's suffrage. Then you had in 1923, the Equal Rights Amendment, never ratified, again, greatly strongly endorsed and supported by the great Alice Paul. So now women are starting to step out and say, well, wait a minute. If we're good enough to vote, and hopefully good enough to work jobs that only the dudes are working, and we should be making the same money as they are if we're doing the same thing, why shouldn't women be able to drive? So here's another huge change in the 1920s. Draw a line out to say more women are going to start driving now. That sense of independence, that sense of freedom, absolutely. And this was, again, one of the mistakes that Henry Ford made was with more and more women driving automobiles in the Roaring Twenties, they didn't necessarily want to drive a black car. General Motors was the one who began to realize, wait a minute, but if there's more women driving, maybe they'll be more willing to buy a car that maybe is in blue or red or yellow or any color besides black. So yeah, I think absolutely, please write this down, that women driving cars absolutely connects with the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, even though the Equal Rights Amendment was never ratified back in 1923, but you're starting to see women starting to step up and trying to exercise greater sense of independence and freedom. If we're good enough to vote in a presidential election in 1920, which I'll be teaching you about, why aren't we good enough to be able to drive a car? So finally, I want to leave you with this great story, and that is, what would you rather have? So the story is, there was a woman. She lived in a rural community. She only had enough money to be able to purchase either a brand new automobile or to be able to install indoor plumbing, a toilet in her house. She had an outhouse, like a lot of people did, especially in the rural countryside. So the question is, which one do you think she chose? Do you think she, A, chose to spend her money on an automobile, or B, do you think she chose to put in a toilet, indoor plumbing in her house, so she wouldn't have to use that outhouse? And the answer is, she chose to buy a car rather than install indoor plumbing in her house. Why? It's real simple. Because she thought it would be better to go, let me rephrase that. It would be, she would rather drive than go. That was the joke. I didn't say the joke right. So there's one more time. So she chose the car because she would rather drive than go. That's the joke I was trying to tell. Holy shnikes. Wow. So ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. My first Zoomcast of the year, live from the Bonk Kitchen. Hey, I hope you enjoyed this one. I love talking about the impact of the automobile. It's a game changer. As I said, I would rank the automobile right up there, again, with the development of the internet back in the 1990s, the personal computer back in the 1980s, the smartphone in the two teens. Life in America looked very different as a result of all of those game-changing inventions. And for our purposes, especially the automobile. So at this point, what I would like everybody to do is, you're now going to take out your correctable tape. You're going to clean up. And again, most of you do a really good job, but there's a couple of you, you've got to clean up anything you crossed out or traced over. Remember, this is a portfolio of your absolute best efforts, and it should reflect that. Then you're going to take your multiple colored highlighters, and you're going to go and you're going to highlight. Don't color. Focus on those words you can visualize in your mind, those persons, places, and things. By highlighting, you're in essence studying. That's why I require students to highlight. It's a natural form of studying. It's developing a greater mastery of the information. Remember, then you're going to take 10 to 15 minutes and you're going to go over your ISN. I think the vast majority of you guys are doing a great job, especially based on what I saw on that Unit 1 exam. It's noticeable. But for some of you who are struggling, you still have not bought into the importance of daily study. Waiting till the night before is a recipe for a bad grade. So we need to change your mindset. You got to bring it a little bit every day. You practice for a sport, you practice for baseball, you practice for basketball to develop that skill to get better at it. Why aren't you practicing for school every day? It's the same thing. Please remember, hand your ISN to somebody in your house, your mom, your dad, an older brother or sister, maybe an aunt or an uncle, who had me years, decades earlier. And you channel your inner Mr. Bonk. You teach the information to them. Talk about the automobile. What industries were impacted by it? The steel, the rubber, oil. Explain why. Talk about why Henry Ford is given so much credit for the automobile if he didn't invent it. You go back to Carl Benz, 1885 in Germany. Go back to the E.R.A brothers back in 1893. You don't talk about them unless you're buying a Mercedes-Benz, but you don't talk about the E.R.A brothers. But we all know who Henry Ford is. Why was he so important? What did he do to transform the automobile industry? And then talk about how the automobile industry changed the face of America. You look at America in 1920, you look at America in 1930, and it's a very, very different place. So again, I hope you enjoyed today's Zoomcast. My next Zoomcast, I'm going to be getting more into the election of 1920, and I'm going to start talking about the first of our three Republican presidents who really have a significant impact on the decade. And that, of course, is a gentleman by the name of Warren G. Harding. And Harding, of course, will be our 29th president of the United States of America. So, ladies and gentlemen, as I always like to say, you know what? The story may have ended today, but you know the saga is going to continue tomorrow. And the rest, as we say, everyone, is history. Peace out, everybody. Thank you so much. And as always, be well.